Hello, and welcome back to the Living a Joyful Life Summit. My name is Alexis Moore, and I'm here with Sharon Salzberg. So, I'm going to read a little bit about Sharon before we jump into this. Sharon is a meditation pioneer, world renowned Buddhist teacher, and New York Times best-selling author. She was one of the first to bring mindfulness and loving kindness meditation to mainstream American culture over 45 years ago, inspiring generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is a co founder of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, host of the Meta Hour podcast, and author of 13 books, including the best selling Real Happiness and her seminal work, Loving Kindness. She published two books in 2023, Real Life, The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom, and Finding Your Way, which was just published. Sharon, it's wonderful to be here with you.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. So, just to start us off, make sure we're all on the same page, can you give us your definition or understanding of joy?
I think that's the hardest question, actually. It's very tough. It's almost easier for me to talk about what I don't think it is. Like, I don't think it's just the experience of pleasure. I don't think it's even happiness in the ordinary conventional term, which could be pleasure or avoiding any presence of pain. I think of it, joy, more as a kind of wholeness of one's being. And with that tremendous sense of integration, like kind of being who we are, there's the possibility of connecting like way beyond the circumstances that we face in front of us, like today, whatever's happening today. There's just a sense of kind of upliftment, presence, belonging to life that I think of as joy.
Wow, thank you. So, working off of that, then what does living a joyful life look like to you?
Well, I think it's having a different holding environment, you could say, for the pleasure and pain that comes our way. Like sometimes really painful things obviously happen, and we also add to them. We like close down around them. We add a sense of isolation. I'm the only one, or this is going to last forever, a sense of permanence, or kind of reifying the state. This is who I really am. Nothing else counted. And whereas we could have a more expansive, open presence that wouldn't feel so trapped. And with states of pleasure and delight and joy that come our way, not everyone has an easy time with those either. Many of us have a kind of conditioning of, well, either we're too distracted or we don't notice, or we're kind of perpetually looking for what's wrong, what evolutionary biologists would call a negativity bias. We're looking for threat, we're looking for danger. And also, people not uncommonly feel they don't deserve it.
Mm,
In their family, there's too much pain or suffering, or they're in a caregiving role, they don't deserve it, or just aware of the suffering in the world, they don't deserve it, and kind of ignoring the need for replenishment and upliftment that we all actually realistically have. And so it's not, it's kind of a transformation, I think, in how we hold all the different experiences that come our way. And we can do that. And that makes for a kind of joyful life because we're not counting on only pleasure, which would be a pretty sad thing to be counting on.
a transformation of how we hold all our experiences. Wow. So, let's see. You know, you are a longtime Buddhist teacher, and Buddhism often gets a bad rap for putting so much emphasis on suffering. So that's not really a fair assessment of it. And can you tell us how joy fits into Buddhist practice?
Well, it definitely gets that bad rap, for that. I mean, I bought a magazine, must have been, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago because they had a big article on the Buddha. And and like a mainstream magazine. And in the article, the author said, according to the Buddha, the purpose of life is to suffer. And I thought, well, that's really depressing. Like, why sign up for that? Why get up earlier in the morning if the purpose is all leading to more and more suffering? And in fact, it's not. Um, if anything, what interested me was the idea that, first of all, the Buddha saying that suffering is inevitable in life, that nobody's life is so picture perfect that there's not going to be pain or loss or insecurity or some fear or something, breaking or whatever. And for me, it was then a 17-year-old, first encountering this kind of notion in college, and it was actually very relieving. It wasn't depressing. It was like, oh, we all have a kind of vulnerability. It's not just me with sort of the oddity of my own family dynamic and loss and things like that. And that sense of belonging, of being a part of something greater, is sort of what I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about when I'm talking about joy. And so, um, I don't think the Buddha meant to be depressing, but it's also true that there is a lot of emphasis on impermanence and how even getting the cherished desire met is not going to last, and that
Mm-hmm.
uh, we can well look elsewhere. But the good news is we can look elsewhere and we can find it. We don't have to just buy into the conventions of society, and which might say, like, if you accumulate enough stuff, you won't die. Basically, is what they say. You won't face change. You'll be in control finally, and none of that's true. And yet, we can find the truth, which is that we have a capacity within us, no matter what we've been through or even going through. We have a capacity for love, for connection, for wisdom, for clarity, and that it may be hidden, it may be kind of hard to find or hard to trust, but we can find it and we can learn to reside there more and more.
Mm. And so for you, how has your ability to hold all experience transformed in your journey with this practice?
Well, it's transformed completely. First of all, I started very young, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, if I was going to describe myself in one word at the age of 17 or 18, which is the age I was when I went to India, it would be fragmented. I just felt completely fragmented, which is why that sense of integration and wholeness is very important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow I had a kind of instinct, it's kind of a miracle actually, that I had this instinct that if I could learn how to meditate, I could achieve that very thing, which was true. And I was going to college in Buffalo, New York, looked around Buffalo for a place to learn meditation because I wasn't particularly interested in the philosophy or comparative religion. I really wanted to know the how to do it. And I just couldn't find it anywhere. So I created this independent study project, presented it to the university, and said I want to go to India and study meditation. And they said, okay. So off I went. Um, I'd say, in the beginning, as fractured as I was, I was very emblematic of the things we just talked about. If I felt a painful emotion, I was ashamed of it or I was afraid of it. So I added that. If
Mm-hmm.
I felt pleasure looming, I was like, I don't know, like. And then there's even an interesting teaching about neutral experience, the things that are not particularly pleasant or unpleasant, the times we tend to snooze or go numb or kind of wait for something more intense to happen so we can feel alive. And, I had that going too. And so it's almost like the definition of mindfulness is being able to be with pleasant, painful, and neutral experience in a different way. So I feel like it all is sourced back to my meditation practice, any transformation I've been through in that way.
Mm. And did you know when you first started having this sense of wanting to meditate and wanting to explore it, did you know that you had that sense of being fragmented, or did that or was it like a general sense of like, I just don't feel great? And then it became clear to you later that it was kind of this sense of fragmentation.
I think it became clear later, like I wasn't that self-aware, as to be able to put a name on it
Uh-huh,
when I
uh-huh.
was 17 or 18. I just knew I was unhappy. And
Hmm.
somehow hearing meditation existed, there were methods, there were techniques that one could explore. And if you did them, you could be a whole lot happier. Uh, lit something up in me, which I do consider a miracle because I was very timid. I was 17 when I, made the plan, 18 when I left. Never even been to California before. I grew up in New York, went to college in Buffalo, and I decided to go to India. It was crazy, uh, but obviously very, very important.
So crazy, it just might work. So yes, yes, I love this topic. I love this topic of what you were saying. Like it's not just looking for pleasure. Joy isn't just looking for pleasure. And that kind of segues into this next question I'd like to ask you, which is about how lots of folks, and I can definitely include myself in this. Like I have a personal experience with this is, turning to joy in an effort to avoid pain. And so kind of doing that spiritual bypassing thing or the toxic positivity thing. Um, so can you explain the difference between that sort of positivity and then the kind of joy that you're referring to?
When I think of joy in a kind of wholesome sense, I think of it more like rounding out the picture.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about a negativity bias, which many of us have, so for example, many of us have the habit of kind of evaluating ourselves at the end of the day. And many of us have the habit of pretty well only remembering or even fixating on the things we did wrong and how we didn't show up the way we wanted to, or we didn't make the impression that we had hoped for. And we can go through the list a few times, and an intentionality, which is not coercive, or violent, but it's really an intention to see a fuller picture of the truth, might be like asking yourself, anything else happened today? Like anything good, any good within me? So it's not to pretend that difficulties were not happening. It's not to try to cover them over or any discomfort they may bring up. But, we can be so fixed in such a narrow little lane of perception. Like we're basically just trying to say, okay, if that is our habit, what happens when we open up? It's the same thing with a gratitude practice. Many therapists, many healers will say that a very powerful thing for any of us to do is to keep a gratitude journal, like write down maybe 3 things a day that you're grateful for. And like at the end of the day, and I always say it doesn't have to be like momentous, it doesn't have to be magnificent. And I also say this doesn't come easily to me. It takes intentionality because when I come to the end of the day, I'll be so much more likely to think about what went wrong, what I can complain about, myself or someone else, or my traveling days. It was always an airline, always some tech issue now, Uh, and so to ask, what else? Isn't to deny any of that, but it's to say
Mhm.
that is a part of the truth. I'm not moving from truth to falsehood. I'm moving from truth to another truth that gets very little airtime. And it's a different picture of life. And so that I think feels different. It can be hard to discern. I'm going to really get your question, but I think in time we can be sensitive enough to distinguish what I just described from can't let myself feel that, or that's too discouraging, let me pretend that didn't happen, or let me just elevate it to a ridiculous degree, like it was so perfect that it happened. I mean, we may feel that afterwards, that is true, we look back at situations and think, it was horrible at the time, but it actually strengthened me for
Mm,
this other challenge to come, or that opened me in a way like I could never have imagined or whatever. But at the time, to insist like it was perfect, we probably don't really feel that, and so it's just like a kind of pretense almost. But people hold on to that very strongly.
mhm, mm. And, you know, you're describing joy as kind of flowing from this process of integrating. And so when we're talking about spiritual bypassing, then it's like part of the experience is not being
Hmm.
integrated. It's like trying to be shoved apart.
Hmm.
Yeah. So can that really lead to joy in a sustainable way if that bypassing is actually happening?
Uh, I doubt it because it's tiring. It's like you got to really insist. And also, it just struck me. I don't know the comparison of how often we say that to ourselves, like that kind of bypassing thing, and
Mhm.
how often we, in a terrible way, say it to someone else. You should think of what just happened to you in this way, which would really be bad. And I think we do that. Uh, some people, as a matter of course, like, no, don't feel the pain of that. Think of it this way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you kind of just called me out. No, but I would do that because that's how I was relating to myself. You
Hmm.
know, I when I first kind of in my first year of working with Meta with loving kindness,
Hmm.
um, I was like, wow, this is great because when I focus on this, I'm feeling uplifted and I'm feeling open and I'm feeling more connected. And so that was really wonderful for me. And I couldn't recognize that that was still kind of not wanting to feel like still having a lot of aversion towards some of the discomfort and like the negative things. It's like, oh, if I just focus hard enough on this, then that's all I need. But then it was still not really tolerable. I didn't have a good tolerance for the
Hmm.
uncomfortable things. So maybe kind of off of that, then, is it possible to experience joy in the midst of sorrow or suffering while also kind of guarding against that spiritual bypassing?
I think yes. I don't think what you did was wrong, and I was really kind of mentally applauding it till maybe you got to the line about holding on tightly or something like that, and that it prevented you in some way from being willing. Because really, we often need those moments of replenishment and delight, or just relief. It's like the way people need rest, and we don't allow it sometimes, and the struggle that when it feels endless, it's just going to be exhausting and not onward leading. And so it's not bad, I
Mm,
think, to move to loving kindness for yourself. I mean, you're the one sitting there suffering over something, and loving kindness for others, because we're not alone in truth. And the more we recognize that, the better things are. Um, when we hold on to it, like this is how I have to feel,
mm,
and I can't allow myself to feel the other side of things, that's a different story. But I think it could be a very healthy impulse, and also takes a little courage, actually, I think, to do it. So I'm applauding you again for what you did, because as much as we shun suffering and we're afraid of it, and we're taught to be afraid of it, these are things we're taught. There's also the possibility of kind of over identifying with it.
mm,
And I mean, that was one of the things about the Buddhist teaching that I found really interesting, because it wasn't that suffering itself was redemptive. Like, suffering is not the point. It's relating differently to the suffering, just like relating differently to the happiness and to the neutrality. So we all know people who suffer and emerge bitter and isolated and self preoccupied, and we probably know people who suffer, maybe even more sometimes, and have tremendous compassion
Mhm.
for others as well as for themselves, and kind of a tolerance for people and interest in people. That always used to amaze me when I would encounter somebody who had gone through, really awful stuff in their life, and they would be interested. Like one of my teachers, this woman Deepama, who suffered really a vast amount, and the loss of two children, the loss of her husband, and heart condition as a result of that, and grief, and and she was so kind and so interested in people. It's like if I had a train journey to Calcutta to visit her, she was really interested. Like, did you get enough tea? And I think, boy, if I've been through what you've been through, I don't know if I'd care about anyone else's train journey, but there's some capacity that people have sometimes, to go through some difficulty and have something so extraordinary emerge from it in the way they relate to others, and very ordinary people. You don't have to be like a spiritual master for that. And so we see it in life, and so it's not about like sitting down and just suffering. It's about shifting that relationship.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that because, yes, on the one hand, it's like, okay, yeah, there can be some gripping to want to keep the feeling that feels better. But at the same time, it did, I think, provide a sense of balancing out
Hmm.
what had more naturally been, more self-deprecation or, like you said, kind of focus on improvement,
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that kind of helped balance that out. And it did create more resilience to
Hmm.
then,
Hmm.
deal with what was really hard. And I
Yeah.
don't think I could have done it without having
Yeah.
built up that
Yeah.
quality of
Yeah.
things. So yeah, maybe yeah, with that kind of asking this question again of like how can we or how is it possible to experience joy in the midst of suffering and guard against spiritual bypassing in the process as well?
I think so. And of course, it depends on how you define joy. You wouldn't expect to be chortling with glee, like when you're having a hard time, But again, sometimes it's easier
Yeah.
for me to understand these things from imagining the opposite. So we have like a bad situation going on, and we feel incredibly alone, isolated, and tormented by that aloneness. There are ways of not feeling so alone. It's through understanding our commonality. This is why I think you see the power of groups, of support groups for different clinical conditions or things in life, helping someone else. Often in those situations, it almost connects us to a sense of resource within that we had been, feeling totally alienated from and feeling helpless and overcome. And then suddenly, oh, and some of my friends with the most severe kind of clinical depression have say they got the most out of volunteering and making sandwiches for people who are homebound or things like that, and um didn't have to be like hugely sophisticated or something like that. So there's some ways in which we can be reunited with our own capacity, with a bigger picture of life, even in the midst of some difficulty. So some of it might depend also on noting our own habits, like what do we tend to pile on to a sense of difficulty, or pain. Like maybe it's isolation, maybe it's a sense of permanence. This is going to be here forever. Um, and then there are the situations which are not so bad sometimes, but then we have a tendency to catastrophize, some of us, like my friend, my colleague Sylvia Borstein calls herself a recovering catastrophizer. She'll say that in a real problem, she's steady as a rock. But in her imagination,
Mm.
like she's 86 now, she calls one of her adult children who are well into their adulthood She'd call one of her adult children and they don't answer the phone. So it's got to be the worst has happened in her mind. She said, it never occurs to me they're taking a shower or they fell in love and don't feel like talking to their mother. And this is why she got into meditation practice actually, is because her mind would just spin out in these kind of scenarios. And when I talked to her not long ago, she told me she had a new mantra or saying she was repeating. And I said, what is it? And she said, not every bus ends up in a ditch. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves this is my imagination, like check it out, before you fly off the handle or things like that. Remembering the truth of change even can kind of help us, be in a different direction. So
Wow.
it's worth noting what we pile on. And also,
Hmm.
I think it's important to kind of remember tools of resilience and allow ourselves them. Like I was doing a program for it was like a 4-year program for domestic violence shelter workers, bringing tools of meditation and yoga to that group. And uh, we would always start each cycle with having people, let's say journal. You could do it as a reflection also. Write down things that they did to lift their spirits, to get some perspective, to get a break. And, in 4 years, I think everyone wrote down, listen to music, one kind or another, or get out in nature. Some people had a strong faith tradition, and that was involved, and. Uh, and then in the next column, we asked people to look at what they'd just written down and see if they had a comment on it. So I kind of took that tool. I was doing a program for military caregivers like medics and chaplains. And so somebody wrote down, I get out in nature, I kayak. It's the most amazing feeling of freedom. And then the next column he wrote down, I haven't done it in about 7 years. You think, well, you know what? Think about maybe resuming or, adapting something, like uh sometimes these things become like highly theoretical and speculative, but we may have tools of resilience that we could and should employ.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I really appreciate these kind of reframes for what joy can look like too. It's like this can look like understanding. This can look like being of service. And when you put it in those terms, it's like, oh, of course I can do that while I'm suffering. You know, being of service can be, I'm just sending a text to someone else to check on them or to listen to them. Um, and yeah, and like I can still get out in nature. It's still okay for me to go and feel fresh air on my skin and appreciate the sun on my skin um, while I'm suffering. And that makes complete sense. I love how you said maybe you're not chortling with glee, but that's kind of what comes to mind almost when the word joy comes to mind. It's kind of that kind of experience. So these reframes are really helpful, and it almost sounds like too it's like the suffering is kind of a pathway into the joy when it can create more compassion and more understanding, and then um, when those things develop, then yeah, that stays with you even after the suffering kind of diminishes,
Hmm.
increase. Wow, so you've shared before a story of Sayada U Pandita visiting your meditation center in Barre, Massachusetts, and giving what was for you some unexpected guidance for being with pain. So, do you remember that story?
Yes. This was 1984. We had invited Sayadaw Pandita from Burma to come here to the Insight Meditation Society to lead a 3-month retreat. And we'd never met him before,
Mhm.
but we heard he was a very, very great teacher. And so we invited him. And I was sitting in that retreat, as were many of my friends. And he was a very great teacher. He also turned out to be very fierce and demanding and intense. He was really a tough cookie. Um, and one day we were in the meditation hall and he was doing a question and answer session. And someone asked him, "How long should I pay attention to physical pain
Mm.
before I move my attention to something that's easier to be with?" So that might be, listening to sound, feeling something else in your body that isn't so painful. It could be a number of different things. And it was an interesting question because we also use physical pain as a kind of model for emotional pain, same kind of skill set. So, how long should I just be paying attention to it before I move my mind to something that's easier to be with? And I thought, given U Pandita Saito's personality, he was going to say you should be with it till you fall over. I really did. And to my amazement, he said, "Don't be with it for very long." He said, "Be with the pain, move your attention to something that's easier. Go back to the pain if it's still there, and then leave it again." He said, "It's not wrong to be with the pain and be with the pain and be with the pain, but you'll likely get exhausted. So why not build in balance all along the way?" Which, I mean, you could have blown me over. Like, I just couldn't believe he was saying that. I thought, if those words are coming out of his mouth, it must really be true according to the teachings, because he was the furthest thing in the universe to say something just to be nice. Um, and it's further interesting because it's not a popular instruction. I find, people sometimes say, "You think I have no courage," or "You think I'm a coward," or "I'm not doing it in the hardest way possible. It couldn't count," or "You're giving me remedial baby steps instead of the real thing." But it is the real thing. Again, it's not wrong to be with the pain and be with the pain. And sometimes it's riveting, but if we can move our attention to something that's easier and come back and leave again, that's building up a capacity to be balanced, to be present. Because the point isn't to be broken by the suffering, but to have enough wherewithal to try to be with it differently. And that's also where wisdom comes, when we can see what our experience is without hating it and fearing it, and also not being just drowning in it, so we can do that. But it also fascinates me how often people don't like that instruction. It's like, you don't think I can do the real thing? And why do we think it has to be the hardest possible path in order to be a valid path?
That makes sense. Build and balance along the way. So, how do you feel his advice fits in with our ability to take in joy or not while we're in pain?
Well, it's not only when we're in pain, but it's maybe, very uh, pointed when we're in pain, that it is basically not wrong. It doesn't have to be seen as selfish or self-satisfied. It's like resilience building. If we think about the stress dynamic, for example, it's really a dynamic. There's the pressure, the circumstance, the incident, whatever's producing the stress, and then there's the resource with which it's met. If you're exhausted, you didn't sleep well last night, you go to work, say you work outside the home, you go to work, you overhear a conversation. It's like a knife in your heart. You're just like, in contrast to, you had a beautiful night's sleep, you had a loving breakfast with the people you're closest to. Uh, you go to work, you overhear the same conversation, you think, wow, person's having a bad day. Both are very plausible scenarios, right? And the difference is not in the conversation, it's in kind of what you have going on inside. So I should add also, sometimes people hear that and they think, well, that means we're never going to try to do anything to change the circumstance or the situation, which is also not true. We do, but why make that effort from maximum exhaustion and depletion and pressure and feeling you've got nothing going? It's just not going to be helpful. And so we it's fine to build up resilience and to give ourselves a break and gather our strength and our energy because we're going to need it with whatever is challenging us and whatever's presenting, and it's a very different way of experiencing things.
Like, how does wisdom kind of fit in with what you're describing right now of noticing the resilience that gets built with adding in balance along the way versus, being exhausted, being drained, but feeling like this is the real work kind of way of going about it? Or if I don't do it this way, I'm not caring enough to change. Like, where's the wisdom
Mhm.
in seeing both of those things for yourself?
Well, the best place, I think, or the easiest place to develop insight or wisdom is a place of balance. Because if we're sucked into something and it's overwhelming, we may not have enough perspective to really see more clearly, like uh, some of these strong emotions, for example, they tend to be very complex. They're layered. There are lots of different strands. Uh, if you're not freaking out looking at your anger or your loneliness or something like that, you're not fighting it, you're not pushing it away, you're not protesting it. And also, if you're not sucked into it and overcome by it, you have some space. And that's the perspective, not completely lost in it, not pushing it away, which allows us to see, oh, look at how much loneliness there is in that desire. Look at how much fear there is in that anger. It's just because we're in a position to observe very clearly that we see all kinds of truths begin to emerge, some personal, some like universal, like truth about change, truth about interconnection, and so on. When we're fighting life or when we feel like victimized by everything, it's not going to happen. It's just not the right relationship.
Not the right relationship.
Yeah, to our experience, because something emerges, an emotion emerges, or a situation emerges, and we're either locked in and defined by it,
Mm,
or we're hating it and fearing it and pushing it away and being ashamed of it, and and just trying to block it, and that doesn't work. So we talk about mindfulness sometimes as a place in the middle where we learn a balanced presence. And I didn't used to like the word balance. I thought it was kind of stupid, I thought, well, that's like being mediocre. Who wants to be
mm.
balanced? But I began to appreciate it, of course, the more I understood it, and especially in terms of, that's the perspective that really can provide wisdom.
You were talking about where we kind of brought up people in caregiving positions and how sometimes experiencing joy can be quite challenging because, perhaps it can feel like can experience joy until everyone else is taken care of. And so, how do you respond when a student tells you that they maybe can't access joy because of that?
I think there are lots of different ways of responding, like some of it is a question of understanding, like even going into what in contemporary science might be uh, the difference between the distinction between empathy and compassion. Empathy being, that resonance with someone's situation. Compassion being a movement toward to see if we can be of help. It's not a movement into to burn up ourselves, and it's not a movement toward to seize control and be in charge, but movement toward to see if we can be of help and to move. Not everyone moves from empathy, from that resonance, to compassion, because you might genuinely feel that kind of resonance, like, oh, that looks really tough, that looks like a really hard situation, and that might frighten you and you might want to run away, or you might be so exhausted to begin with that you think, just go away, I can't listen.
Mm.
or any number of other things. I have a friend who's a therapist who told me for a brief period he judged all of his clients. Like they tell him a story and he'd think, I told you 6 months ago what to do. If you'd only done it, you would have been better off. Or we can have that weird savior thing going on, like I'm going to be the one. Or we can have the compassionate response. And so, in that way, compassion is implying balance. Maybe it's compassion for you and for me. Maybe it's compassion and wisdom, like I will do everything I can and I'm not in charge of the universe. Sad to say, I can't fix it. This timetable, like, I'm not in charge. So it doesn't mean we don't try or we're not present, but actually the kind of attachment and fixation and frustration doesn't need to be there because we have wisdom, so that urge to help also needs to be balanced by a realistic sense of limits. Not everything happens by Tuesday night or whatever, and not everything happens in the way we would like precisely to see it happen either. Um, and so sometimes it is a more kind of, say, theoretical discussion about that, but the theory is also helpful for people so they don't feel so embarrassed, And so, like it's only them who has this issue. And sometimes it's really practical instruction. Like I've had a teacher say to me, be mindful, try to be mindful every time your hands are in water.
Mm.
So some little exercise of something that's a totally negligible experience that I would never think has any element of delight in it. When we're not multitasking, we're not fretting, when we're washing the dishes, but we're actually experiencing it, there is a kind of fullness of being, which is joy, which can happen in the most ordinary kinds of experiences. And so sometimes we do them together, sometimes we uh, suggest somebody find the activity that they want to try to do mindfully. Generosity will bring joy. Not if you're in a role of caregiving, not that same old one, like which you're tired of perhaps or worn out by. Uh, but in some surprising way, singing for somebody or um, uh, offering to take a little kid for a walk or whatever it is, and uh, or just being sure, one reflection we do sometimes is how many other people need to be doing their job well for you to do your job well. To realize like, oh, it's also this kind of interconnected web, and it can bring a lot of joy to realize that, that we're part of a whole picture here.
Mm. Mm.
And also, it's, I think, always helpful both for community of caregivers or community of people with a particular issue. I'm taking care of a partner who had a stroke, or I'm taking care of uh, this situation, or especially if you're dealing either as a person in your family or professionally with some of these systems, which are really hard to navigate. And um, sometimes we help each other most. Like I've taught retreats for caregivers,
Mm.
and I remember somebody saying they had somebody at home they were taking care of, and they could never get away. They didn't know how to get away, and someone else in the room said, "No, you can get away. And here's some resources. Here's a way that there's respite care. You can't get away for a year, but you could likely get away for a weekend, and there could be psychological preparation for that, so nobody feels abandoned and things like that,
Mm. And so, how could experiencing joy actually build resilience for a person who might be in a position like that?
Well, it does. It's like nourishment,
Mhm. Mm.
if you think of the opposite, which is just getting worn down,
Mhm.
it's like one problem after another. It seems ceaseless, one phone call trying to find a doctor, after another, and dealing with the inexplicable health insurance world. Like, I have a friend who's she's married to a woman who's very disabled, who had a very early stroke, early in age. Uh, her wife can't leave the house except in an ambulance.
Mm.
And she just got a notice from the insurance company that her wife's no longer disabled. It's like, huh? These things are hard. They're very hard. And if you feel like that's all there is day in and day out, you're not going to get any sleep. You're not going to just have that, kind of relief. And we need some relief. Things can be very hard.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what comes to mind, I guess, with the example of your friend and then associating with personal experience is like, well, if I don't keep my mind on the pain, then it's like I'm not really caring. I'm not really caring if I turn my attention elsewhere or something. I'm not, yeah,
Hmm.
really doing the work
Yeah.
that needs to be done or something.
Yeah. I think that's very astute. I think that is the fear often, but um, mindfulness could be a big help here too. Let's just look at the toll, like look at the consequences. And uh, when you don't sleep at night, look at how you are the next day. It's just that way. You could say you shouldn't sleep because there's so much to do, but
Right,
in the end, it's very consequential.
right. Yes. Mindfulness allows us to kind of keep going, to keep going. We need to be mindful so we can keep going kind of all day long and really sustain. And that's the sense that I'm getting from this idea of balance is sustaining, remaining, yes, resilient, fortified, nourished. And that just makes sense. We can keep going versus the other way. It's just going to burn out. Um, it's like it's kind of funny. It's like, okay, guys. So practicing experiencing joy. It's actually not selfish. This is like the best thing that we can do so that we can really show up for ourselves and our endeavors and our people and everything. It's like
Mhm.
otherwise, other way, we're actually gonna kind of be taken out.
Seems that way. I mean, look at the burnout rate for people and um, what people describe as, so many scientists describe as an epidemic of loneliness. And we're not doing that well, by and large.
Right. Right. So for you, what are some of your favorite ways of cultivating joy?
Friends.
Mhm.
Um, I'm a city girl. They say New York City, strangely enough. I'm not going to say the Redwood Forest because it wouldn't be true. I mean, that also is tremendously joyful, but it's much more rare. Uh, I I was born and grew up in New York City, so this kind of rhythm that's
Mm,
in me. I like it a lot. Uh, Creativity, others' creativity as well as my own. I love theater, um, and things like that. I'm fascinated by something like theater because it's collaborative creativity, like people working
mm,
together to make something. I actually love teaching. I get a lot of joy out of teaching. I get a lot of joy out of the sincerity of people um, and their efforts. Um, I love my own teachers and uh, still have some that are alive. And, I've been sitting online with them for over 3 years. Um, yeah, it's, relationships with friends and teachers and all the, all the kind of things we get to do.
mm. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, yeah. Heard a lot of openness within that. We brought up isolation came up a couple times, and this sounded like really kind of the opposite. And so as we move towards the end of our time today, then what are some final things you can share with our audience to help people live a joyful life?
I'm sure I'll just repeat myself, in the
Perfect.
uh, I
Yeah.
think it's more near at hand than we usually imagine, and that life doesn't have to look perfect by any means, in order for us to feel whole and connected and uh, kind of not feel so beaten down by the circumstances that we face. And it's really available both within, in terms of inner resource and in sense of community, to go forward in a different way.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. And so finally, Sharon, how can people learn more about you and your work?
Probably the easiest way is just my website, SharonSalzberg.com. So it's all there.
Wonderful, wonderful. SharonSalzberg.com has all of the resources and entry points. Thank you so much, Sharon. This was a really fascinating conversation. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's very Buddhist. We talked a lot about suffering, which was really in the midst of a conversation about joy. It was great.
I think it's great too. It's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.